Hello everyone, Canon Louie here. This time for Path of Exile, the Expedition League has started. So I wanted to throw out my thoughts and opinions of this league, its mechanics, what I think is good, and what could be improved on. So with Expedition, you can encounter one of, I think, four or five different people that you can interact with, and they give you a detonator that you can spread around, essentially explosives, to unearth various different rewards. So for an example, for these posts here that show chests, they will provide more monsters and more loot than just the skulls that are lying around. And then these kind of bigger chests modify the monsters that it spawns in a specific way, and it gives you some bonuses to the loot as well. And some of these are very important to pay attention to, because sometimes they can actually unearth monsters that are immune to specific types of damage. So obviously if you're playing a fire damage build, for an example, and you unearth monsters that are immune to fire damage, that's going to cause issues. And apparently they can even spawn with hits are always critical strikes or penetrating resistances. So let's get started and see how much I could do. So when the various different graves are highlighted, that means they're in the area of effect of the explosives, and you can have up to 3 different explosives out at one time. So let's place one right here. Hopefully I'll be able to take out all the monsters in that spot. And then I am going to go for here, and then maybe just right here. And then once you place your 3 explosives, you can detonate them, and they also have a limited range from the various different chains of explosives. So let's go ahead and get started. And as you can see here, they do explode in a sequence, so it's very similar to Abyss, except you can kind of dictate how hard you want them to be. But for some reason this expedition here has actually been incredibly easy compared to the ones that I tried before. I am really not sure why that one was so pathetic. But normally these have a lot more monsters and a lot more difficult monsters, and I even get Chaos Orbs. And I didn't reach that one.
Need something?
So for each of the characters, you can gamble specific currency that you get from the different chests. So you can get this thing, Astral Algai, I'm sure I butchered that, to refresh what their wares are. And then there's a few different types of currencies that you can use with each individual vendor. And I think most of these, you do gamble for them. So for an example, I could gamble for the shield, and it can spawn with being magic rare and so on.
Good luck.
So overall, I think this league mechanic is not bad. I didn't think that it was too cumbersome. Like some of the leagues, like Heist and so on, like there's just so much that you need to learn in order to do that gameplay aspect well, and also like leveling up certain things in order to make it worthwhile. For Heist, you had to level up each of the companions and stuff like that. And some leagues are definitely a lot simpler, like Legion. You just press the monolith and then go. And this one's kind of in between, where I don't really think that, because they only have 3 explosives, or at least so far, I mean, I'm only in the old fields in Act 2, as of right now. I think this mechanic, I like it, personally. But of course, just like any League mechanic, your mileage may vary. But it was very shocking to get 3 Chaos Orbs already, and having that few of monsters. There's normally like 3 times the amount of monsters. I don't know why that one was so lackluster. So with the League mechanic explained and taken care of, I do want to talk about the general changes about the League. So I did, in a previous video with my friend Warmonger that I usually play Path of Exile with, about our overall thoughts of like what grinding gear games want to push Path of Exile, like what direction they want to put it in. And the major changes overall was that the end game damage was nerfed by between 20 and 40% depending on what build you were doing. They directly nerfed the values of many of the support gems, so you can't get theoretically super crazy damage. And then they nerfed flasks, especially. And they also made the beginning of the game a little bit harder. And I think they might have buffed some monster life across all of the acts. It was just kind of like an overall buff. But they are planning on fine-tuning each of the acts in order to make them more challenging. So, throughout my playtime of Act 1, which it sounded like that's what they focused on this time, I didn't really find it to be that much more difficult. But I did notice that the monster life, as well as some of the monsters, actually move very quickly. So they're kind of pushing for certain enemy types move much faster than your character. Like we're talking like maybe 130% movement speed, when at the beginning of the game you only have 100% movement speed unless you're lucky enough to get movement speed boots and so on. So overall, I didn't really find myself being really in danger of dying. And I've been using rolling magma, which I'm sure isn't the best skill, but it's been working okay for me. And it's also worth noting that I haven't taken any damage nodes on the skill tree because this is going to be a support character. So I could have definitely had a slightly better time if I did that. But really, what it felt like for me personally, and keep in mind that I'm more of a casual player, I'm not a hardcore Path of Exile player, that it just felt like the act was so much longer, because with the monsters moving faster, it pretty much forces me to defeat them in order for them to not pile up into becoming dangerous, if that makes sense. So instead of making the game harder, which I mean, it technically, yes, it has been made harder, but I never really had any issues except for like the flicker strike ghosts. I think they buff those, which are annoying as is. They just made them actually dangerous if there's like a group of 10 of them. There was at least 1 or 2 instances where I almost did die there. But overall, instead of making it harder, it just feels like it makes it so that you prolong the act. You're already slow at the beginning of the game, but now since monsters move faster than you in some instances, you're forced to kill them, slowing you down even more. So I really, since I don't really like grinding through the acts in the first place, that's not a positive. So I'm guessing if you use the meta strategy of using Stormblast Mine, you probably didn't really have any issues with the beginning of the game. But for me, even using rolling magma, I didn't really have too many issues. So with that being said, though, the biggest change that I think was, quite frankly, a slap in the face was the Flask Exchanges. So they reworked Flasks to try to make it so that you don't have 100% uptime on them all the time anymore. So you get less Flask charges in Act 6 through 10, and then even less on top of that once you reach maps. And then on top of that, they made flasks like the Quicksilver Flask have a larger amount of flask charge consumption. And that was something that also slowed me down, was that the Quicksilver Flask, previously I would be able to have it up an okay amount of time, but now it just feels like I have to kill so many more enemies to get it charged that it becomes irritating. And then on top of that, they made it so that this flask is a great example. You can no longer have 100% uptime on immunity to ailments anymore. And that is primarily because when you get an ailment on your character, you're only immune to it for 1 second. So to put that in perspective for anyone who didn't know previously, that you would gain 4 seconds of immunity in the previous patch, if not longer. So with that only being 1 second, unless you have literally infinite flash charges, it's pretty much impossible to be completely immune to ailments anymore. And on top of that, you have to actually be inflicted with that ailment or curse or whatever in order to gain the immunity in the first place. And that's one of my biggest issues with this, is that in the later stages, even in Act 1, I was being frozen quite frequently, and the monster damage wasn't really enough to kill my character by any means, but when the damage does become high enough to kill my character, let's just say Act 5 or later, then that's going to be really annoying. Freeze immunity flask was pretty much required at a certain point anyway, especially for endgame. But now, since you can't even rely on being immune to ailments that make you really vulnerable, I can see myself getting a lot of deaths that I really couldn't do anything about. You know, taking a crit and being frozen in a mob of enemies, and then just instantly dying, or, you know, something along those lines. But they did make it so you can change flasks now, that you can basically buff a utility flask to make it last longer, but it can't gain charges during its duration. And then the second method that you can change flasks with is making it so that they're automatic. And maybe that sort of alleviates the immunity to ailments when you really need it, to have the flask automatically activate when you get frozen. But I'm not far enough through the acts to really know anything about how well that actually works. So overall, I think this league is okay for the mechanic itself. I wouldn't say that it's super extraordinary and exciting, or anything really out there. But really, the general changes that they did were really the big downside of this patch, that I really don't like the idea of making the game harder in this way, and trying to push for, you have to really know what you're doing in order to even play the game in the first place, let alone excel. Because I felt like, especially in endgame, you can easily make the game as hard as you want. So forcing me to play at your level of difficulty is really irritating to me. Like, if you want the game harder, especially in maps, that's what Delirium is for. That's what the super bosses are for. But for me, being content with doing rare corrupted tier 16 maps, I don't really want that level of difficulty. So them trying to push for that is not the direction where I personally would want to go. I thought that having that optional difficulty was definitely a way to go. But with that being said, though, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this league, whether whether you agree with the changes or not. But with that, have a wonderful day.